Greetings, good to be here today in the studio. We have Nigel Ajay Kumar. Hey Nigel, it's so good to have you in the studio here this morning, and just want to talk about the art of research and just your background and your take on it, and
Sure.
what you're involved in now, just a little bit. So, just could you begin just by maybe telling us a little bit about yourself?
Okay. Thanks, Uday. Thanks for inviting me here. I think it's great what you're doing here to share with students a little bit of the journeys of various other teachers. So my name is Nigel Ajay Kumar, and I've been a teacher at SAIACS, though currently I'm writing a book on research methodology. That's what I'm working on right now. I've done my MA in Christianity at SAIACS. I've done my MTH in theology at SAIACS, and I did my PhD in theology at SAIACS. So I'm very much of a SAIACS product in that sense. And a lot of my thinking about theological methodology has been from a SAIACS point of view and also for a SAIACS point of view.
Mm-hmm.
I've thought of my MTH.
What does that mean from a science point of view?
So in a sense that whatever I've learned about research methodology, I've learned here.
Okay.
It's not like, of course, I've had some exposure elsewhere, but it's mostly from this place. But I've also, my entire PhD, which I did, was in view of what I think is important for a SAIACS student to know. So it's also, as I was writing it as a template for others. Like I said, not just the content, but how we address a topic theologically would also be how, let's say, we would expect a theology student at SAIACS to address it. So it was something like that. That's why I said from SAIACS and for SAIACS.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it could apply to other people, but it's mainly because of my local context. It applies here.
Sure. So, in terms of research interest, so tell us now. You've done your THM or MTH over here, as well as your PhD.
Yeah.
And those are two very different kind of domains. And
Yeah.
so why don't we just kind of go ahead and take a little step back in time and just tell us about the MTH and how you arrived at your key research interest and topic.
Okay, so just to give a context to it,
Mm-hmm.
I came to SAIACS as a faculty in training, which means that I joined SAIACS in 2003 to become a faculty at SAIACS, but the process is to an MTH and a PhD. So in my view, the PhD was very much the goal.
Mm-hmm.
So when I started my MTH, I just simply thought of it as a stepping stone. I thought of it as, let me just finish off the MTH degree and then get focused on my PhD. So
I can just stop it. I think that's a great kind of comment that you made, that you didn't just want to come to the MTH as a terminal thing, but you had a long-term view. Is this going to lead into a doctoral program?
Yeah.
So that's awesome. Yeah.
But I'm going to say that in a negative way, because I think what happened was when I came to an MTH just thinking I was ready for the PhD, I think I wasn't aware of the challenges of the MTH. I think I didn't realize how difficult an MTH was in the first place. So I remember I had to choose an MTH thesis topic, and I honestly said, let me take something easy, and then at my PhD level I'll take something harder. So that's my choice. But a person who was my mentor in my PhD level, I knew him as a friend at my MTH level. He said, don't do that. Do something that you're happy with and build the skills that you need for a PhD. So do something hard, like do something that will actually challenge you so that you'll know whether you can do a PhD or not. So that was
how do you define easy and hard at that time?
Okay. So in theology, basically we have like some theologians, we can call them the masters. We have the big people like Calvin or Karl Barth or Augustine. These are the big players in theology. So if you engage with them, you have to know a lot of complex material, understand their contexts, read a lot. And then there are the other theologians who are not the masters, but they are significant in their own way. So, and they've made a good contribution. So I thought I would take an easy theologian. I would take somebody like who's just, who's written a little bit, maybe 1 or 2 books, and focus on that person. And then later on, develop a more detailed study. Mm-hmm. But early on, I was advised, get the masters under your belt early. So focus on those big people in your discipline and get to know their thinking as fast as possible. So for me, that became Karl Barth. He's one of the hardest theologians for theologians to address. So at my MTH level, I actually was encouraged to focus on Karl Barth and then study him so that that would then form my thinking, not just for my MTH or PhD, but also my larger thinking. I've got a frame of reference to think either I agree with him or I disagree with him. And so that's what my MTH thesis became, a study of Karl Barth's view of religion. That's part of what
So now, okay, like you said, Karl Barth, one of the major theologians, at least in the Western Hemisphere, and even maybe globally. So what prompted you to pick up Karl Barth? I mean, as opposed to Indians, right? You haven't grown up there.
Okay, so that's a good question, because my MTH topic was so when you said hard, if I just did Karl Barth, that would be okay, still straightforward. I study one theologian and then I'd say what he said about religion. But my work was a historical study of Indian theologians in the 1930s and 40s, how they looked at Karl Barth. So I was looking at Indian theologians, but particularly three Indian theologians, Chenchaya, Chakaraya, and Devananda. And they were writing around the time Karl Barth was writing. So I was looking at Karl Barth's view of religion, and then these three Indians' view of religion and how they responded to Karl Barth. So in that sense, it was a complex historical study. I had to look at not just Karl Barth, but that context, Indian theologians looking at him. And so that's how I integrated the Indian perspective.
Okay. Yeah. So just to kind of help our audience over here. So when you say historical, I mean, so how did you even arrive at that historical? Because I'm just thinking, if you're going into an MTH and if you're trying to look at Karl Barth, okay, so now what about, where do you begin?
That's also a good question there, because in theology, sadly, because I'm speaking from a theology perspective,
sure.
So in theology, we can focus on the theology, which means the content of what a person is saying. He believes this, he says this.
Okay.
Or in theology, you can focus on the historical theology. How and why they are saying what they are saying. How and why did this theologian come up with these ideas? Who was he or she responding to? What was the secular thinking at that time? What was the Christian thinking at that time? And what were they saying and what were their influences? So this historical focus is very strongly emphasized at SAIACS. So in any topic we do, we have to have a strong historical focus. So what I did was I focused on a particular segment in history where these Indian theologians who were just coming out in their own, 1930s, 40s, 50s, just pre-independence of India, of how they were thinking. So actually, I didn't even know this era. I just said I want to look at Indian perspectives. And as I started reading broadly what other scholars are saying and what Indian theologians are saying, I found these three engaging with Karl Barth in a way that was very surprising. I didn't realize that they would be engaging with Karl Barth. And
now you just happened to come across them three, or were they referred to you, or how did you arrive?
So it was that time Dr. Ashish Krispal was the principal at SAIACS, and he was also the HOD of theology. So he said, in fact, he was saying, don't just do a Western theologian, do some Indian theologians. So he was suggesting that. And so he said, why don't you look at how Indian theologians look at Karl Barth? Now he was saying, look at the 1960s and 70s, around that time when Samartha and Panikkar were writing. Maybe around that time you'll get something. But I found that even prior to them, many references to Karl Barth came in the 30s and 40s. So I got a hint from my mentor. But at the same time, as I started reading further, I found actually I need to narrow down, and rather than just take everybody, just take one segment. And I actually accidentally came across it. It was like just reading and said, hey, this looks good. And my choice of Chenchaya, Chakaraya, and Devanandan was just convenience. Like, okay, I could take many more. I could take M.M. Thomas, I could take others, but I'll just take these three and focus on them and see what they have to say.
So since we're on this, the idea of, arriving at a topic, I'm just wondering, so between the MTH and the PhD, how did the PhD topic selection process differ?
So my MTH, as I said, was quite challenging for me. I went through a lot of difficulties in choosing this topic. In going through this topic, it was a very hard process for me. And initially I had to go through Karl Barth, I had to go to the Indian theologians. But then after that, I had one chapter where I looked at contemporary views of religion and then said, how therefore should we look at religion? So it was my final chapter, probably chapter 6. And by the time I'd looked at Karl Barth and Indian theologians, I'd already run out of time. My deadlines were getting over and I was overwhelmed. And so my mentor, who was David Samuel for my MTH thesis, I went to him with a plea. I said, look, I don't think I'll be able to do my 6th chapter on contemporary views of religion and also constructive views. He said, you don't even need to do it. You just focus on Karl Barth and this as a historical study. That can be a basis of a later study. I said, I can do that. He said, yeah. So I said, wow, that just saves me so much work. So I finally finished my MTH, but with this thought that I do have this contemporary views of religions to discuss. And that's what my PhD was based on. I started with the thing that, okay, my MTH is this, but there were many unsaids, many things that I hadn't done. And so I said, now let's start looking at contemporary views of religion. And from that, I got influenced and I got exposed to a lot of people who criticized the concept of religion, who said religion does not exist, it's a historically constructed category. And from that led me into a new way of looking at religion that I had not even conceived at my MTH level. And so the MTH was the starting point for my PhD, but my PhD completely reoriented what my MTH was doing and even what I would do in the future.
That's great. Yeah. That's great. Now, just coming back to that initial whole idea, as somebody starting off, even getting into MTH and the whole idea of doing research. I don't know about you, but I had a big gap between my college and, doing my further kind of graduate studies. And a lot of us do that. But how did you get into that frame of mind? And, what were some of the, anxieties or doubts or fears in personal, otherwise academic, how did that all come together for you?
Yeah, so for me, I did my MA at SAIACS. And I was the kind of student who, when I came for my MA at SAIACS, I'm not trying to be proud, but I said I got A's in everything. I wrote a paper, I would get an A, and everything. So in my MA, so my MAs were not challenging academically. They were more challenging spiritually and socially and theologically. It was more internally I was challenged, but not academically. It was very easy. So when I came
I don't want to get up on a rabbit trail, but when you say internally challenge theologically, like what? Can you give us an example? Or?
I think I was still growing up
Okay.
in my faith. I was still growing up in my maturity. I was really emotionally drained, spiritually drained. Even though academically I was doing well, but in my MA days I was really far from God. I was really struggling to understand whether God even loves me. Those kind of issues.
Yeah.
And so for me, the MA was more of a pastoral journey. Academics was just by the way. It was like, I know. And whatever I did was doing well because of good English, creative thinking. I think it was easy to do well in academics. When I came to my MTH, I thought it was a little bit of the same thing. So I came with a bit of pride, a bit of, it won't be that hard. And so for my first few months, I sort of went through MTH saying, I'll do it. But then by my 3rd month at my MTH, I remember a professor coming to teach us from outside SAIACS, and he asked a question, who knows this subject and who knows this topic? So my classmates, there were 4 or 5 of us, and 4 of them raised their hands, and I didn't raise my hand because I knew nothing about the subject he was talking about. So then he looked at me and said, you did a SAIACS MA, is it? I said, yeah, I did a SAIACS MA. He said, that's why you don't know. So then I realized that these people who've done an MDiv program from other colleges had a much broader exposure to a topic than I did. I realized that SAIACS, MA, the theology was only one module, and we didn't know much more about other things. And so we had one module, we knew methodologies, we could understand and do research, but a knowledge about the breadth of theology was not there for me as a SAIACS MA student. And so at that point, I realized that I had to just figure out what was happening, learn almost the basics from scratch, and then catch up at that MTH level. So by my 3rd module, I realized that all my pride had to just go down, and humility and even shame came up. And I had to really work hard to understand the subjects that I was given. So understand who are the main players, what are they saying, at least just basically understand, and then find an MTH level research paper to write. So it became a very difficult process from my ME to MTH, and I realized that sometimes we come with pride. So I didn't have anxiety, but I eventually got the anxiety when I realized I was so far behind. and I had to do a lot more work to catch up with others, my own peers.
Yeah. What kind of prepared you for the task, you feel? What were some things that you had going for you? Like, one of them might have been English and you're already good with it, but in order to kind of finish well, what kind of...
I think because we are writing in an Indian context. Indian Christian theology was a very important part of my formation, both at my MA and my MPH level. If I wasn't exposed to Indian Christian theology and contextual theology, I don't think I would have done a good MPH thesis. I would not have been asking questions like SAIACS forces us to ask, relevance to the church, why are we doing theology, what sense does it make, who are the other Indians saying such things. So I think that was very formative for me at the MTH level, and it shaped me not just for my MTH but also for my PhD and even today.
Yeah, I just want to pause there. I think that's very critical and very important, Nigel, because I think a lot of times we need to trust that the experiences we've had until thus far, whether it's been in work, whether it's been on a previous academic study, has given us what it's going to take for us to move forward. And we can't discount it and begin anew on a whole blank new set. I know, does that make sense? Or
Yeah. So, but like, I came from an urban Indian context before I came to SAIACS. So I didn't really have much knowledge about India. I came with I just assumed I was an uncritical Indian in the sense of I just assumed my Indian identity. I didn't know what that meant to be Indian and Christian, whether there was any problem with that. It was only after coming to SAIACS where I realized even the fact that I'm an outsider, that being an Indian Christian, we are not always accepted by a majority of people. That itself, I learned only here at SAIACS. Because in an urban context, you don't really experience the isolation as much as perhaps in a rural or a mid-rural context. Maybe people did in an urban context as well, but I didn't. I came from, you could call it a semi-elite or maybe even an elite context where somehow these issues were not there. But when I started understanding grassroots issues, what are happening in the villages, what is happening in our Indian history, what are the challenges facing Muslims, even Hindus, even Christians, it helped me to become aware of the Indian context. And not just Indian. In SAIACS, we also focused on Asian Christian theology, where there were others like Indians who were struggling, Indonesia, Malaysia, Korea. These are contexts where they were trying to understand their Christianity and identity after British rule or after colonial rule. How can you be a Christian even though that was the religion of the oppressors of the land? How can you maintain faith in that Jesus? So these questions became very important through my formative years.
So tell us, is there a story or episode that kind of jumps out of anything back in terms of, what kind of marked that MTH process or prepared you for it during some
session? There's so many stories, but again, a story of failure. I think one of the biggest challenges I faced at my MTH thesis writing time, it was just very terrible, was remember I said my work was about Karl Barth and then looking at these three Indian theologians, and I remember reading those three Indian theologians, a whole month of research, a bit more than a month, going through what they're saying, what do they say about Karl Barth, and taking the notes. And by the end of the month, where I had to write the chapter, I realized I could not write the chapter because I hadn't distinguished Chenchaya, Chakaraya, and Devanandan from each other. I only focused on what they were saying about Karl Barth, but somehow their voices got merged. So it became Indian theologians and Karl Barth rather than Chenchaya has a unique voice from Chakaraya, has a unique voice from Devanandan. What were they individually saying and how did they distinguish from each other? And in the middle of my work with the deadline of my thesis just a month or two away, I suddenly realized I had to reread all these three again to understand that I'm not just focusing on Karl Barth, I'm focusing on them and understanding their uniqueness. So that was a time when I felt so broken. My deadline was coming up. I almost felt like giving up. It's like I felt like I was a month behind, and but then I talked to my mentor who was there, and he said, "Look, don't worry. Just focus, just get it right, and then we'll see what happens, whether you need an extension or whether you need to rework anything." And thankfully, as I started reworking, I got the distinct voices. And it took again another month. It was not easy. It's not like I automatically got it. I had to work an extra month. And then the college allowed me an extension for about 10 days to finish up. They understood that this was a big research issue, and they allowed me to even take an extension. And then I finished my work, and I was much happier with it. But it was with the grace of SAIACS, with the grace of my examiners, that I realized that actually I messed up. I didn't read properly. But then that corrective process of realizing I made a mistake was very formative for me. Taking proper notes to distinguish voices, that really shaped me for current and future research.
Yeah. I mean, I would think even, maybe it wasn't so much a mistake, but I think the nature of the task requires that we read multiple times, right? Would you say that?
Yeah, I think, but I wasn't even aware of the problem of not reading carefully. I think I just assumed that I just read and then write.
Yeah.
But the idea of distinguishing, especially when you're dealing with multiple scholars, distinguishing them from one another, rather than simply what they are saying, that thing was just an extra level that I wasn't even aware of.
Right.
And only when I got into it did I realize what was expected. And so it was a big challenge for me. That's another reason why I call this hard. But it was also a very good learning experience for me.
Great. I think, we're talking about the writing, but I think, you bring up a interesting piece, and a very critical part of the puzzle is this whole idea of reading and what we call the literature review, so to speak. So as you kind of thought about Karl Barth, and then, somebody suggested to you, 3 Indian theologians, how did you know how much to read, what to read, and when to stop reading, and when it's enough? How did that kind of... for the MTH?
Yeah, so at the MTH level, I think Karl Barth is a good example because the Indian theologians have a different writing process, and the Western theologians have a different. So Karl Barth has written 4 key volumes called the Church Dogmatics. Apart from that, he's written another book and a few other articles and all that. That 4 volumes are actually divided into 13 volumes, which are there in the library, but it has a very good index. So what I did was, to understand Karl Barth, I used initially a lot of secondary literature to understand what Karl Barth is, what is he saying about religion. So I looked at good, trustworthy secondary literature on Karl Barth, understanding him generally. Then what I did was, when they would quote Karl Barth, I would find what they quoted. If they would say, Church Dogmatics 2, volume 2, book number 3, then I would say, let's go to that passage and read that. So I used the secondary literature as an inroad into Karl Barth. And so that helped me to not go blind into Karl Barth, which is a very difficult thing to do, but to go with help, go with the good, trustworthy scholars, go to Karl Barth, and then go to primary reading of Karl Barth. So that's how I did. It was like a little bit of secondary, then a little bit of primary, little bit of secondary.
So for example, initially how many articles would you have read to get an idea of what to read in Karl Barth?
Yeah, so first was to identify who has written about Karl Barth and religion. So first find those books and find those articles. And there were quite a lot. I don't remember off the top of my head how many there were. But find out who are the main people who talk about it. There is a book I know on Karl Barth and religion, but there are several articles.
But just, if you were to tell, an MTH student today, is going out to study, so would you recommend read 5 articles, or is it more like 20? Or?
Yeah, I would say 5 to 15. That it's a good number. At least initially, you may need to do more, or if you don't have enough, then maybe less also if you don't find. But 5 to 15 is a good number of sources on any topic that you're doing, at least initially. So that's what I did for Karl Barth. The thing with Karl Barth is it's very dense. Even the secondary literature is difficult. So I know, like there's the Cambridge Companion to Karl Barth, but there's one chapter on religion. So I read the key chapters in that Cambridge Companion. I didn't read all the chapters in that book. I read the key chapters, plus I read the chapter on religion very thoroughly. Plus then I looked at another book, I looked at many articles, I looked at summaries of Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics, basically to make sure I understand Karl Barth. But one thing to say, I didn't just start my MTH thesis trying to understand Karl Barth. I had already started reading Karl Barth while I was doing my MTH process. So as I was studying my modules, I tried to start reading Karl Barth even during my modules. So little by little, I was doing this process. So rather than just start my MTH and say, well, start Karl Barth, I did a bit of that work earlier, because it does take a lot of time to understand who Karl Barth is and what is he saying. So that's how I started.
So in terms of your research, it's interesting. So what did you discover in terms?
Okay, so at the MTH level, so I started with the assumption, which many people have, that Indian theologians are antagonistic to Karl Barth. They don't like him because Karl Barth is very opposed to this concept of religion. He's very exclusivistic. There are many things about Karl Barth that many don't like, and today also Karl Barth is not very popular. But so I went with the view that Indian Christians don't like Karl Barth. And I started my whole thesis with that assumption. Then, as I read Karl Barth, I described what he said, went to the Indian theologians, and suddenly realized there was much more congruity between Karl Barth and Indian theologians than I anticipated. In fact, they agreed a lot with him, especially in his criticism of the concept of religion. Chenchaya, for instance, was also similarly critical of Karl Barth, and in fact quoted Karl Barth to say that I agree that this is wrong, religion is wrong. And that surprised me, it broke my assumption. And so as I started reading, I realized that these Indian theologians were quite smart. Both they had read the Western theologian, they had read Karl Barth, and come up with their own view, saying, we agree with this, but we don't agree with this. Mm-hmm. And that surprised me, that in 1930s, 40s, we had these Indian theologians who were quite astute in what they were agreeing and disagreeing. And that was a great learning for me. And I found an insight that I hadn't seen in other books. I hadn't seen this idea which I was talking about.
Why was that surprising?
Because I didn't expect Indian theologians to like Karl Barth. I didn't expect them to be using Karl Barth. Mm-hmm. I mean, we sort of say Indian theologians will use Hinduism or will use, we have this assumption that Indian theologians will be pluralistic or Indian theologians will be just accept Hinduism but reject the West. But here was some Indian theologians who were reading the West and taking from it certain things and also rejecting. Yeah. They were being astute in the 30s and 40s, and this is not even now. Today we expect that. But at that time they were that good. And of course we can criticize the early Indian theologians for their elite stance, for their Brahmanical thinking. We can always critique them. But these were good scholars, and even some of them were lay people. They were not even trained theologically, but they were still doing a lot of good work and good thinking. And I would say good, fresh, original thinking about taking their faith, looking at what the West is saying, and also saying what their own ancestors in the Hindu faith were saying, and trying to bring it together and say, so therefore who are we and how do we say it? That insight and that new respect for Indian theologians really came as an insight at that time for me. Mm-hmm. Both as respect as well as what I learned, how they were doing things.
Is there one particular, briefly, just some insight, theological insight that you can share as an example?
So at that point, at my MTH level, it was more this understanding that Indian theologians were understanding of as well as understanding of the West and not simply just rejecting it. So it was more a methodological insight rather than a theological insight. The theological insights of Karl Barth were by themselves interesting. That religion as a category is problematic, that God does not care about religion per se. That was what Karl Barth was saying, that he judges religion, including Christianity. That religion stands against Christianity. So that's something that Karl Barth would say. Mm-hmm. But Indian theologians were saying the same thing. So that's the theological insight, that God stands outside religion. That religion is a man-made thing. Yes. It's something that would be became a very common idea even among Indian theologians, that God is outside the dogmas of the West, the dogmas of ultimately Christ is central. That's what they would say. It's Christ versus religion. Mm-hmm. It is not religion. So that was one thing that at the 1930s, 40s was a common idea. Barth was saying it and Indian theologians were saying it as well. Mm-hmm. So it was a historical insight as well as a theological insight. Okay. Should I say in the PhD what then moved forward? Yeah. So then what happened at the PhD level was that in view of contemporary criticisms of the concept of religion, which is what my discussion was the question was, what is religion? Was my PhD question. Mm-hmm. So there I looked at how all religion is a human construct, the word religion. The word has its own history, and we just give it meaning. So as a Christian might say religion is this, whereas a Hindu might say religion is this, and a secular scholar may say religion is this. But the basis of this meaning was very fluid. Who said that this is right? What makes a Christian view of religion correct and a secular philosopher's view of religion correct? And I realized that very few people have a grounding that this is the view of religion. This could be said, it is a view of religion. So what I argued was that, yes, it is a view of religion, but Christians can have a view of religion. based on scripture, based on our Christian traditions, we can develop our view of religion, which will be different from, let's say, secular views or Hindu views, but we should be authentic to our view, which is authentic to our sources. So that's what I call the theology of religion. It is our view of what we understand the category.
Now, when you say our,
as Christians, as theological, yeah.
Indian Christians.
Indian Christians as Christians, because in the sense the dialogue was with ancient Christians, Western Christians, as well as Indian Christians. I focused on Chenchaya's view of religion, as well as Augustine, as well as Barth. So it was focusing on India because the concept of religion is very important here.
Right.
At the same time, the sources were not exclusively Indian. I looked at a more global stage, secular scholars, to come up with what I argued for was a dual theory of religion. That there is a secular view of religion where all of us come under, but there is also a Christian view of religion which we impose on others. And we must be able to work with both. So that was my insight that I finally proposed in my PhD.
Okay. So fundamentally, between the MPH and the PhD, what would you say were the marked difference in terms of doing research?
So on one level, the description of Karl Barth, I had to do at the same intensity at the MPH level and at the PhD level, meaning I had to know primary text. At the MPH level, you cannot say I need to do only secondary text, and in MPH level, I can do primary text. It's a PhD level. It's both. I had to do primary text. But what I found was that the scope at the PhD level was much higher. At my MTH level, I was primarily focusing on content. I was focusing on what Karl Barth said and what these Indian theologians said. At my PhD level, I was focusing both on content and methodology. How did Karl Barth say what he was saying? And actually my focus became more on the Indian theologians. So how did Chenchaya say what he was saying? Why was he saying what he was saying? And how was it influenced by others who were saying similar things? So the focus was not just what he was saying, but fundamentally on how. So even my answer, what is religion, what I ultimately suggested as this is the answer, was also an answer of how we come up with the answer. It was both an answer of what is religion and how do we define this word. A theological method, a theology and a method. So that was at the PhD level. It was much more complex in that way, where at the MTH it was just this is the content. But at the PhD I had to come up with a justified way of coming up with answers. So that was probably the big differentiation between MTH and PhD.
Yeah. So I know you've also recently written an article on critical thinking. Published.
Yeah.
So how would you advise? I mean, how does that fit into the whole realm in terms of doing research for MTH?
Okay.
Or PhD. Yeah.
Okay. Critical thinking is. I wrote that article in view of what I've been doing as a teacher of research methodology. After my PhD and then eventually teaching MPH students research methodology, I looked at the current curriculums of research methodology. How are people learning? What are people teaching? And critical thinking was a very important component of it. They teach critical thinking and then they say research. But when I looked at what is critical thinking in contemporary books, I found out that it was very abstract. It didn't make sense for researchers. It just made sense for critical thinking. It was how to make reasoned arguments, how to defend your arguments, that was it. But did it make sense for a researcher? So I found that rather than thinking of critical thinking in abstract, think of theological research critical thinking. So how can we do critical thinking to help theological researchers, like an MTH student? And then I realized that the way we teach research critical thinking can be adjusted a bit and to formulate in such a way that we follow the logic of how you write a paper. So
could you briefly describe?
So basically, critical thinking would be when we as teachers expect critical thinking from our students, we expect 6 things. So the first thing is broadening. We expect a student to know broadly what is happening in the field, and that means know the people who disagree with you. Don't just know the people who agree with you. So if you like one theologian, read the people who disagree with that theologian as well. So broadening means read outside your comfort zone. But then comes the next thing, narrowing. Don't just go broadly, narrow down your topic and be able to highlight that which is important. It is highlighting a problem, highlighting that which is significant, highlighting the key ideas of a scholar. So that is critical thinking, broadening and narrowing. Then the third part of critical thinking, third and fourth part is analysis and evaluation. So what I found is many students just believe evaluation and analysis are the same thing. And I think sometimes teachers also don't clarify. So what I felt was analysis was working with multiple scholars and multiple views and showing their relationship with each other. This is without judgment, without saying right or wrong, basically saying one scholar views this, another scholar views this, and another scholar views this, and this is three different positions. Being able to show relationships, being able to show trajectories, being able to show historical foundations are what we call analysis. How and why is the person saying what they are saying is an important way we identify critical thinking in a work. Is the student's work good critical thinking? Do they have good analysis? Then comes evaluation. After you analyze, then you have to say whether it's right or wrong. Which view is right, which view is wrong. This is when we come to that aspect of critical thinking where we evaluate one view versus another. What makes something worthwhile? We may use our own standards. We may say, oh, it's closer to the Bible or closer to evangelical thinking and so on and so forth.
You say the whole idea of theory then comes into play. We use certain theoretical lens to...
Yes, so at that point, yes, exactly. The analysis would reveal 3 or 4 theoretical lenses. One scholar is saying what they're saying because they're applying one theory. Another scholar is saying something because they are aligned with another theory. So then when you come to evaluate, then you'll say, oh, I like this scholar, but I don't like their theory. I don't like their methodology. Or I like this theologian's methodology, but I don't like their theory. I don't like their statement. I don't like their views. So then you can learn how they are saying what they're saying as well as what they're saying. And you come up with, okay, this is what is the standard. This is what is right. This is whatever we come up with. We may either say biblical, we may say evangelical, we may say we want to prioritize Augustine's work, we may want to say we prioritize Johannine thinking. We prioritize one thinking and then use that framework to evaluate others. That priority can be an assumption, that priority can be a logical choice, however we define it, but it helps us to evaluate other choices. So that's number 4. So broadening, narrowing, analysis, evaluation. Then 5 and 6 is constructing. Now you say what you are saying. You evaluate others. Okay, one is right, one is wrong. But now is your thesis. What are you saying? Defend your thesis. Defend your proposal. So that is what ultimately is where your writing comes in. Not just evaluating, but this is now what I believe, what I offer the world. That is my number 5 in critical thinking. So once I'm able to defend my view. But number 6 is application, implications and applications. Now I take my idea and I bring it to the world. I say, oh, it applies to my church. It has implications for my ministry, implications, or even applications where it can actually affect the way we do things. So that's the logic of critical thinking. It follows the logic of a research paper, follows the logic of a thesis. And that way of critical thinking, I think, is more useful for a student to think about saying, oh yeah, right now I need to do broadening. Now I need to do narrowing. Now I need to do analysis. Evaluation, thesis writing. Okay, now I apply my thesis. So some people mix and match.
When you say thesis writing, you mean what is my
perspective? My perspective, my proposal. What am I saying?
Yeah. And a lot of that is, at least at the MTH level, a lot of that is taken from what you've been reading.
Yes. So the thesis will still be your thesis. Even to say I agree with Martin Luther is still your thesis. To say Martin Luther is correct. Or if I say that this interpretation of John's gospel is correct, even if it's somebody else's interpretation, my view that it's correct is my thesis. So ultimately my thesis is what I promote to my church or to my context.
Well, that's fabulous. Thanks. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a helpful schematic for people to follow. One of the things, about this whole writing process is, what did you get out of it all? What at the end of the day, what was your takeaway? How did it change you? How did the process change you? This is to help those of us who are maybe entering into the process or maybe somewhere in between and got stuck,
Yeah.
So at the end of it, how did the entire process change? How can one prepare for that?
So one, as I've been confessing, is humility. Humility of self, that I don't know everything. It's what leads us to broadening in the first place, that I don't know everything. Therefore, I need the works of others to teach me. I need to learn what others are saying. So that really changed me, the humility, that I don't have all the answers. The other thing that it taught me was discipline. the narrowing is not just anything and everything that I have to say, but I have to focus my attention. I have to do something in a particular way that is not a be-all solution for everything, but it's a narrow solution for a narrow problem, and I need to stay within this confines. Don't try to do everything. Just narrow myself, just be more disciplined and focus on that. So these are two things I know I learned a lot. The other thing was the idea of the difference between implications and applications. I realized that sometimes I'm able to make implications, meet suggestions for the church. But applications is a much more practical thing that requires me to apply literally on the field. And if I just make proposals, that's still only implications. But application means taking it into the real world. Mm-hmm. And that thing was also humbling, that simply me talking about religion or talking about this is no point. Yeah. Ultimately, we need to be able to translate it into action. Right. So the application was an important part of this research. Mm-hmm. So these were three things. Of course, there were many more things, but these were three things that I certainly learned for self.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's very interesting coming from a behavioral and social sciences perspective. I think maybe that's an overlap.
Yeah.
Because people always think, like you said, theology isn't from the ivory towers, and it's abstract and conceptual. Yeah. I think but it doesn't need to be. It can be, I suppose. But even I think when you bring it down, there is an empirical dimension to where you would actually test, the claims that you make or the theoretical lens that comes out at the end of it. And even thank you. That's great. Very helpful. How about even personally? I mean, I know you have a family, you have a wife and a lovely daughter. And how does that kind of fit into the whole mix of writing and research?
So I think my MTH was very difficult, yes, but my PhD was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, honestly, other than parenting. I think parenting and writing my PhD are the two hardest things I've ever done. It was very interesting that when I wrote my proposal, when I submitted my PhD proposal, as soon as I submitted, within 3 days, my daughter was born. So it was almost like as my wife was pregnant, she gave birth to our daughter. I gave birth to this proposal. And then making that proposal grow up to a final dissertation to submit was very hard. It was a very thing, and it took its toll on my family. My family, especially my daughter and my wife, really struggled with my absence. Even if I was present, by my intellectual absence, by my trouble, by my anxieties, it was a very difficult time. And I would urge students to just go for counseling at that time. I didn't even know that I needed counseling, but counsel at least. Get people to help you, not just academically, but talk about it. I was actually quite alone here because by the time I was doing my PhD, there was no theologian on campus. So my mentor was in Canada, I was here. So there was a lot of distance between us. So just understanding that you need collegiality, you need people, you need support. And that was something that I think I missed, especially being here in a very isolated context where other theologians were not here. That was something, but it really was very difficult for my family. And I would give my wife full credit for bearing with me, for supporting me, for doing the best that she could to handle me as much as handling the situations around her. And I think all of us, including my daughter, were very relieved when my PhD was over. Said, okay, at least this part of your life is done. Of course, you will always be a student, you will always be a researcher, you will always be a writer. But that struggle of a PhD, that vulnerability that comes, the challenges, I'm glad that part of my life is over.
Right. It is definitely. But the good thing is, like, there is a beginning and there can be an end. You could just have to go through it. Yeah. So looking back at the MTH and the research process in general, whether it's PhD, and what might you have done differently?
I'm actually grateful to God's sovereignty that I landed up doing what I did. So I'm actually very thankful that I did what I did. But I do realize that I think because of my calling as a teacher and as a researcher and as a writer, I needed to take this difficult path. I needed to go through this process. But I don't think everybody needs to go through this hard process. Other people have different challenges. Some people come to MTA studies with a lot of financial strain or family strain or relational strain. And God is dealing with different people differently. So as a researcher, what I basically, and as an examiner, as a teacher, we basically find, okay, what are the minimum requirements and what are the maximum requirements? And it's not the same for everybody. It's okay if somebody does a project that's easier. It's okay if somebody takes a project that's more complex. In fact, if you're a good student, I would still say take a topic that is easier. Don't take something that is too ambitious, especially at the MTH level, because you are learning skills. You're not trying to change the world in MTH thesis. Your dissertation is just a small part, which not many people will read, but it's to build skills that will hold you for good stead for many years to come. So focus on skill development and thinking development and theological formation, rather than this is the ultimate purpose of my life. So putting an adequate view of your MTS thesis and say, okay, it's not the be all and end all of my life, and then do something that is within the scope of your work. So don't take something too big. If you have only 5 months to do it, then do a project that will take only 5 months. I realized even I had to be less ambitious. So narrow down, come down to something that is manageable is a very important thing I would tell students today. Even at the PhD level, I must confess that the humility I learned at MTH, I sort of lost it at the beginning of my PhD level, thinking I can do this vast project that I was doing. But I realized that as I started my project, it was a bit too hard for me. And some of my teachers at SAIACS have said, I think you're going to find difficulty. And I said, no, I'll handle it. But I realized that no, I wasn't able to handle it. It was really a very difficult process. And I would tell PhD students now, actually don't take that path. Don't take such a difficult topic that overwhelms you. Take something within the reasonable expectations of your institution. So if your institution expects this much, do this much. If you want to push the limits a bit more, it's okay. But don't go too much under the expectations, but don't try to overreach too much. Don't try to impress too many people with your PhD. Try to work within the scope of your ability and the scope of the material available to you and the scope of the institutional expectations. The limitations of your library may limit the scope of your work. The limitations of your academic ability may limit your work. Your limitations of your environment, like what does science expect, could limit your work. Say, okay, I need to do only this much or this much I'll do. Right. Or I need to do this much, so I need to raise my game. Yeah. So understand institutional expectations would also be something that I would urge people to recognize.
Yeah, that's great. How would you kind of advise, like you said, you already have a few pointers to people intending to research, but anything else you would like to people know?
I think I would say, because I'm not really interested in research for research's sake. We are talking to Christians here, and I'm concerned about Christian research, and I want to tell beginning researchers to say research is needed in the church. This is so crucial. It's one of the biggest things that the Indian church needs. It doesn't just need people who have good insights. We just don't need people who have good opinions. We need people who have opinions in relation to what other people are saying. We want people to know what the world is saying and then come up with fresh ideas. We don't want Indian Christians to be close-minded. We want them to be open to what is happening in the world, what is happening in society, what's happening in Hindu culture, in Muslim culture, and then say what they're saying. So research and understanding what others are saying is crucial for an Indian Christian theologian. So it's almost a godly act, not even almost, it is a godly act for an Indian Christian to do research. Of course, others don't do research or they do limited research, that's okay. But if you're called to come into an MTH program or a PhD program, it is a very godly task to spend time trying to understand what people say. God wants you to know what others are saying so that you can grow in what you want to say, so that you can help the church to become better in what the church is doing. That's the goal. So it's a very spiritual process for me, and I don't want the students to ever forget it. It is not for your degree that you're doing this. You're doing this to serve the church. You're doing this to follow the Lord. You're doing this to grow spiritually and theologically. So you're doing this in view of what the Lord is enabling you. I would want all students, including myself, as I continue to do my research, to remember this is a godly task.
Well, I think that's been awesome. Thank you for carving out the time to be here.
Thanks.
And to share those deep insights.
Yes.
Thanks, man.
Thanks for inviting me. Thanks.